The auditorium was heavy with anticipation, every seat taken, every camera pointed, every light glaring down like 1,000 unblinking eyes. This wasn't just another panel discussion. It was theater, it was power, and everyone inside knew that something unforgettable was about to happen. At the center of the stage sat Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, posture relaxed, chin tilted with the casual arrogance of someone convinced he could not be challenged. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice dripping with smugness. "You see," he said, pausing for effect, "Hollywood types love to play heroes on screen, but when it comes to reality, they don't understand discipline, tradition, or the real America." The words cut through the room like glass. A few in the audience chuckled nervously. Others frowned, shifting in their seats. It wasn't just a jab. It was a dismissal, a belittling of an entire culture of dreamers and creators. And then, before the awkward silence could settle in, a voice rang out. Tom Cruise. He didn't shout, but the intensity in his tone silenced the room. Cameras swung toward him, flashes firing like lightning strikes. His eyes locked on Thomas with an unblinking steadiness. "Discipline?" Cruise began, his voice steady, deliberate. "Justice, I've built my entire life on discipline. But unlike your version, mine doesn't dismiss people. It lifts them up." The crowd gasped. Heads turned. Reporters scribbled furiously. The smug smile faded from Thomas's lips, replaced with something rare. Hesitation. The atmosphere shifted. In an instant. The audience wasn't just watching a panel anymore. They were witnessing a showdown. And make no mistake, you're going to want to see how this clash unfolds. Because what Tom Cruise unleashed next would ripple far beyond this room. Before we dive deeper, make sure you subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to see arrogance meet its match. Trust me, you'll want others to be part of this moment, because this was only the beginning. But no one in the room was ready for what came next. The silence after Tom Cruise's interruption lingered in the air like smoke after an explosion. For a moment, even the sound of cameras clicking seemed to pause, as if the entire room was struggling to catch its breath. Clarence Thomas, one of the most powerful men in American law, had just been challenged, not by another judge, not by a politician, but by a man whose career was built on film sets and box offices. But this was no ordinary clash. This was Hollywood, colliding with Washington, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. On one side sat Thomas, an emblem of entrenched authority, cloaked in decades of judicial power. His decisions shaped the nation, his words carried the weight of law, and his critics often described him as untouchable. To his supporters, he represented tradition. To his opponents, he symbolized a fortress of arrogance. On the other side stood Cruise, not just an actor, but a cultural icon. For decades, audiences had watched him leap across skyscrapers, fight impossible odds, and embody resilience. But here, stripped of scripts and stunts, Cruise wasn't playing a role. He was confronting real power in real time. And that contrast made the moment electric, because the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just about a movie star defending himself. It was about whether courage, even from the most unexpected places, could pierce the armor of establishment. Power. The audience felt it too. Murmurs rippled across the hall. Some whispered that Cruise had gone too far. Others, eyes wide with admiration, whispered that he had just spoken the words many were too afraid to say. Reporters texted editors. Phones buzzed as the first tweets flew out into the digital storm. Tom Cruise just checked Clarence Thomas live. The clash wasn't staying in that room. It was already escaping into the bloodstream of the internet. And that's where the stakes grew even sharper. Because while Thomas wielded legal authority, Cruise wielded something harder to contain, the court of public opinion. And in today's world, that court was often louder than the supreme one. As the spotlight tightened, it became clear this wasn't going to be dismissed as a celebrity outburst. This was bigger. Much bigger, and if you thought this was just another celebrity soundbite, you'd be wrong. This moment, this spark, was about to spiral into something far greater, something that would ripple across America and beyond. The cameras zoomed closer. Thomas leaned forward, visibly irritated, now ready to strike back. But Cruz didn't flinch. His calmness only made the tension sharper. This was no longer a polite exchange. It was a collision course between two visions of America, one rooted in hierarchy, power, and dismissal, and another rooted in courage, dignity, and the belief that truth belongs to everyone, not just the elite. And the question hanging in the air was simple: who would win? Because as the world leaned in to watch, one thing became clear. This showdown wasn't staying inside those four walls. It was about to ignite a firestorm, and what Clarence Thomas tried next would only make it worse. To understand the weight of this confrontation, you have to understand Clarence Thomas, not just the man on stage that night, but the towering shadow he had cast over American life for decades. For years, Thomas had built his reputation as one of the most silent, most reserved figures on the U.S. Supreme Court. While other justices sparred with lawyers during arguments, Thomas would often sit quietly, rarely asking questions. But behind that silence, critics argued, was not humility. It was calculation. A man who didn't need to speak much because he believed his power was already secured. His rise had been dramatic, even controversial. In the early 1990s, his confirmation hearings shook the nation. Allegations, accusations, and heated debates made headlines across every newspaper and television channel. Yet despite the storm, he emerged unscathed, elevated to a position from which he could shape the law of the land. To his supporters, this survival was proof of resilience. To his critics, it was the beginning of an era of arrogance. Over the years, his rulings and positions often fell squarely on the side of entrenched power. He became a symbol of conservatism so rigid that compromise seemed foreign. He didn't simply disagree with his ideological opponents, he dismissed them. Activists described encounters where Thomas seemed almost amused by criticism, smiling faintly, as if the voices of ordinary Americans were background noise. That faint smile, the same one that curled across his lips before his jab at Hollywood, was more than an expression. It was a trademark, a signal that he believed himself untouchable. And in many ways, he was. Protected by lifetime appointment, insulated from elections or accountability, Thomas occupied one of the highest thrones in America's halls of power. Politicians came and went, celebrities rose and faded, but his position remained constant, unshaken, unmoved. Yet with that security came distance. Distance from the struggles of everyday citizens who looked at the court as something far away, a place where decisions about their lives were made without their voices. Critics often described Thomas as detached, uninterested in the lived realities of those outside the marble columns of Washington. Worse still, he seemed to relish that detachment. When confronted by activists or questioned about his decisions, Thomas rarely showed the vulnerability of doubt. Instead, he projected certainty, unyielding, unbending, and to many, unfeeling. It was this reputation that had followed him onto the stage the night he faced Tom Cruise. For years he had laughed off critics, brushed aside attacks, and outlasted scandals. To him, opposition was just noise. He had seen it all before, and nothing had ever toppled him. Why should a Hollywood star be any different? That was the dangerous mistake. Because arrogance carries with it a blind spot. The belief that no one outside your circle of power can threaten you. The belief that truth is irrelevant if you hold enough authority. The belief that image is armor. And so Thomas leaned back in his chair, smirking, certain that his words had once again silenced dissent. He believed he had reduced Cruise to just another actor playing hero. But arrogance, no matter how well protected, always underestimates one thing: the power of truth. And when Tom Cruise unleashed his truth, it wouldn't just dent Clarence Thomas's armor, it would shatter it. If Clarence Thomas carried the aura of distance and untouchable authority, Tom Cruise carried something else entirely. The scars of struggle, the weight of reinvention, and the relentless discipline of a man who refused to quit. Long before the cameras flashed that night, Cruise had lived a life defined not by privilege, but by persistence. Born into a working-class family, his early years were marked by instability, hardship, and the feeling of being an outsider. He struggled with dyslexia, often humiliated in classrooms where words seemed like locked doors. Teachers doubted him. Classmates mocked him. For a boy who dreamed of big things, the world seemed designed to remind him of his limits. But Cruz didn't surrender. Where others saw a learning disability, he saw a challenge to be conquered. He trained himself relentlessly, memorizing scripts, repeating lines until they became muscle memory. Every obstacle became fuel. Discipline wasn't just an idea for him, it was survival. And then came Hollywood, a place known for crushing dreams as easily as it creates stars. Cruz entered not as a sure bet, but as an underdog. Yet through sheer work ethic, through charisma that refused to be ignored, he climbed. From risky business to Top Gun, from Jerry Maguire to Mission Impossible, he wasn't just playing characters. He was living proof that resilience could rewrite destiny. But it wasn't smooth. Fame came with backlash. Public scandals, tabloid headlines, moments where the world seemed eager to laugh at him rather than applaud him. He stumbled, yes, but he always stood back up. Every time the media tried to bury him, he reinvented himself, sharper, stronger, more disciplined. That was Tom Cruise, not a man who had been handed anything, but a man who had fought for everything. And this, perhaps, was why his words on that stage carried such force. Because when Cruise spoke of discipline, he wasn't speaking in the abstract. He was speaking from the battlefield of his own life. He had lived rejection. He had lived humiliation. And yet, he had transformed those wounds into fuel. In that moment, Cruz represented more than himself. He became the voice of anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or written off by the powerful. He wasn't a judge in robes, insulated by lifetime appointment. He wasn't a politician shielded by donors and spin doctors. He was a man who had climbed from the ground up, through failures, through reinventions, through sheer will. And that made him dangerous to someone like Clarence Thomas, because while Thomas projected cold certainty, Cruz radiated human fire. Where Thomas seemed detached from ordinary lives, Cruz's very career was built on connecting with them. Millions had cried, cheered, and felt inspired by his performances. He wasn't just an actor, he was a mirror of human resilience, someone whose story people recognized in pieces of their own struggles. So when Cruz challenged Thomas on discipline, the contrast was unmistakable. One man spoke from a throne, the other spoke from the trenches. This wasn't just a movie star speaking, one commentator would later say. It was a man who had lived through battles of his own. And that was the key. Because in a nation tired of being lectured by untouchable elites, Cruz's words resonated. They weren't the polished talking points of a politician or the detached analysis of a judge. They were raw, lived truth. The crowd didn't just hear him, they felt him. In that instant, Cruz stopped being Tom Cruise the actor and became something else. Tom Cruise, the truth teller. It was a transformation that Thomas, in his arrogance, had never anticipated. He had expected an easy dismissal. He had expected laughter. Instead, he found himself staring into the eyes of someone who refused to bow, and as the cameras rolled, as the world leaned in closer, one thing became certain. This battle was no longer symbolic. It was personal, because Cruz was not simply defending himself. He was defending the very idea that ordinary people, dreamers, and underdogs had a voice worth hearing. And that voice was about to grow louder, much louder. What happened next would turn a single exchange into a full-blown showdown. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a tension that felt almost unbearable. The cameras didn't blink. The microphones picked up every breath. The crowd leaned forward as if caught between two gravitational pulls, one toward the power of the courtroom giant Clarence Thomas, and the other toward the defiant calm of Tom Cruise. At first, the exchange seemed almost predictable. Clarence Thomas, with the smugness of a man used to never being challenged, let out a dismissive chuckle. His lips curled into the faintest smile, the kind of expression that could silence entire rooms in Washington. "Oh, please," Thomas sneered, tilting his head ever so slightly. "Actors pretending to understand the real struggles of this nation? You live in fiction. I live in reality. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some clapped politely in agreement. Others shook their heads. It was a line designed to wound, to cut deep, to remind everyone that he saw Cruise as nothing more than a performer, a man who read lines for a living. But Tom Cruise didn't flinch. He didn't frown. He didn't even blink. He let the words hang there, heavy, suffocating, while Thomas leaned back in his chair as though victory had already been declared. The crowd shifted uneasily. Murmurs rose like a low tide. Was Cruise out of his depth? Was this where the superstar would falter? And then Thomas doubled down. His voice grew louder, his tone sharpened, as though he were rehearsing a closing argument. You charm crowds with stunts. I interpret the law of the land. Don't confuse applause with authority. The words landed like thunder. The audience was divided, half nodding, half frowning. But through it all, Tom Cruise remained perfectly still, almost unnervingly calm. It was psychological warfare. Thomas pressed harder, mocking Cruise's sincerity. He scoffed at his passion, painting him as naive, a boy playing dress-up in a man's world of power. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. He thought he was untouchable, but Cruise, oh Cruise, was waiting. He let Thomas talk, let him dig deeper, let the villain's mask slip further with each smirk, each scoff. The actor knew what few dared to believe. Sometimes silence speaks louder than rebuttals. Sometimes restraint is the sharpest weapon. And then he leaned forward. The audience froze. The lights caught the faint determination in his eyes. His voice, lowered, steady, piercing. You know what the difference is, Clarence? You hide behind titles. I face audiences with nothing but truth. And right now the truth is this. Power without accountability is just arrogance dressed in robes. The row. Silence that followed was deafening. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters nearly dropped their pens. The crowd sat in stunned disbelief. For a moment, Clarence Thomas blinked, almost startled. He had not expected the movie star to strike at the very heart of his reputation. His smile faltered. His jaw tightened. The room shifted. The balance of energy flipped in an instant. Cruise had not shouted, had not postured. He had simply exposed. And yet the battle wasn't over. The clash of worlds, Hollywood versus Washington, fame versus power, truth versus arrogance, was far from finished. But in that precise second, with millions watching across the nation, the impossible had happened. Clarence Thomas looked rattled, and Tom Cruise, he wasn't done, not even close. Cliffhanger. And then, with the entire nation watching, Tom leaned forward and delivered the line that shattered everything. The room was suffocating with silence. You could almost hear the hum of the lights above, the click of a single camera shutter, the faint intake of breath from someone in the back row. Clarence Thomas leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, like a man clinging to the last shreds of control. But the faint tremor in his jaw betrayed him. He had expected deference, obedience, maybe even awe. What he got instead was Tom Cruise, unflinching, steady, and now, about to strike with a force no one saw coming. Cruise paused. He let the tension marinate. Every great performer knows the value of silence, and in that moment, silence became his stage. His eyes scanned the crowd, not for validation, but for connection. He wanted them to feel it, to live it, to remember it. Then he spoke. You say I live in fiction, Clarence. But here's the truth. I've seen men with power destroy themselves because they believed their robes made them gods. I've played heroes and villains on the screen, but in this room, he tapped the table for emphasis, his voice rising, like a slow crescendo. You are the villain. The words landed like a lightning strike. Gasps tore through the audience. Phones shot up, recording every syllable. On Twitter, hashtags ignited within seconds. Cruise vis Thomas, as truth bomb. A power exposed. Thomas shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to force a smirk, but it came out stiff, unnatural. For the first time, the mighty Justice looked small. Cruise didn't stop. He leaned in, his tone sharpening with precision. You interpret the law? Then tell me, Clarence, when was The last time you interpreted the pain of the people you're supposed to serve? When was the last time you stepped outside those marble halls and listened to the voices that don't come with lobbyists' checks? Power without empathy isn't justice, it's tyranny. The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't polite clapping anymore. It was raw, guttural, defiant. Even those who had doubted him earlier were on their feet, swept up in the current of his words. Thomas tried to interject, but the momentum had shifted. He opened his mouth, only to be drowned out by cheers. The judge who had silenced so many. Others now found himself silenced by a wave of ordinary people who, in that moment, had found their voice through Tom Cruise. Cruise's delivery grew even more cinematic. He paused between each point, letting the weight of his words hang like thunderclouds. You laugh at critics because you think you're untouchable. But let me remind you of something, Clarence. Empires fall. Kings fall. Judges fall. The only thing that survives is truth. The audience was spellbound. Some were crying. Others held their phones with trembling hands, knowing they were witnessing a cultural earthquake in real time. And then came the line that broke everything open. Cruise stood, his voice steady, eyes burning into Thomas. You call what I do fiction? Fine. But here's the difference between my world and yours. In my world, the audience knows it's a performance. In your world, you've fooled yourself into thinking your act is reality. But Clarence, your script has run out. The crowd exploded. Thunderous applause, shouts, whistles, the kind of roar usually reserved for stadiums, not hearings. The cameras shook as reporters scrambled to capture the chaos. Social media melted down in real time. Clips of Cruise's takedown spreading like wildfire across TikTok, Instagram, and Thomas's face went pale. His jaw clenched. He tried to fire back, but no words came. Every attempt at retort died before it left his lips. For the first time, Clarence Thomas looked like the defendant, not the judge. And Cruise, he wasn't done. He raised a hand, asking for silence. The crowd obeyed instantly. The room was his now. He lowered his voice, almost to a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. History doesn't remember the titles, Clarence. It remembers the courage. And courage isn't hiding behind robes. Courage is standing in the light, facing the truth, and owning your choices. Can you do that? The camera zoomed in on Thomas, sweat glistening on his brow. He had no answer. Cruise delivered the final blow, sharp, unforgettable, the kind of line that would echo for decades. You see, Clarence, authority without accountability is just a costume, and tonight you've been unmasked. Boom. Mic drop. The crowd went berserk. Applause thundered through the chamber. Some leapt from their seats, fists in the air. Others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering, "Did that really just happen?" Online, the clip was already trending worldwide. Memes flooded in. Headlines were drafted in real time. Tom Cruise schools Supreme Court Justice. Hollywood. Hero versus Washington Power. The night Clarence Thomas fell silent. And through it all, Clarence Thomas sat there, visibly shaken, unable to reclaim control. Cruise didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply sat back down, folded his hands, and let the roar of the people fill the void. The balance of power in that room had flipped. The judge who thought himself untouchable had been reduced to silence, while the actor everyone dismissed as a mere entertainer had become the voice of accountability. And as the applause echoed, as hashtags trended, as whispers spread like wildfire, across the chamber, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning. Cliffhanger. The crowd exploded, but the shockwaves had only just begun. The explosion inside that chamber was only the beginning. Within minutes, the energy spilled out into the digital universe, where moments don't just live, they multiply. On Twitter, the hashtag #CruiseVsThomas rocketed to the top of global trends. Clips of Tom's mic drop takedown spread like wildfire, hitting millions of views before Clarence Thomas had even left his seat. Memes began to flood in. Cruise's defiant glare frozen into GIFs. Thomas's stunned silence looped endlessly, with captions like, "When you realize the script is over." TikTok was no different. Edits set to dramatic music went viral, turning a tense political exchange into cultural theater. Young people who had never cared about Supreme Court debates, before suddenly stitched videos saying, "This is how you speak truth to power." On Instagram, stories lit up with Cruz's final line, "Authority without accountability is just a costume," overlaid on neon backgrounds, reshared by influencers, actors, even athletes. And then came the celebrities. Big-name actors, singers, and comedians weighed in. Late-night hosts built entire monologues around it. One headline read, "The moment Hollywood took Washington to school." For a generation hungry for authenticity, Cruz's words became not just entertainment, they became a cultural reference point. But the impact didn't stop at entertainment. Politicians jumped in too. Some tried to dismiss Cruz, sneering that actors shouldn't meddle in politics. But their words only highlighted the irony. Because while they sneered, their own constituents were reposting Cruz's speech with captions like, "Finally, someone said it." Journalists scrambled to keep up. Cable news replayed the clip in a 24-hour loop, dissecting every word, every pause, every shift in Thomas's expression. Editorials hit the presses. The night truth spoke louder than power, from Top Gun to Top Truth. Commentators debated whether Cruz had crossed a line, but one fact was undeniable. He had struck a chord that echoed far beyond Hollywood. And ordinary Americans. They felt it. In coffee shops, on campuses, at kitchen tables, people repeated his words. Parents told their kids, "That's courage. Don't ever be afraid to speak truth to someone bigger than you." For once, it wasn't a politician or a pundit shaping the conversation. It was a man best known for action movies reminding the country what real action looks like. The ripple effects were staggering. Activist groups clipped the moment into campaign ads. Motivational speakers quoted it on stage. Educators showed it in classrooms as an example of rhetoric and courage. Suddenly, Tom Cruise versus Clarence Thomas wasn't just a clip, it was a cultural flashpoint, a shorthand for dignity triumphing over arrogance. And as the story spread, Clarence Thomas's image shifted. His once unshakable aura looked fractured. The smirk that had seemed untouchable was now replayed side by side with his silence under Cruz's gaze. For the first time in decades, his power looked human, vulnerable. But perhaps the most powerful validation came not from pundits or politicians, but from the people. Comments flooded online. "I've never respected Cruz more." Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking. He turned a hearing into history. Even those who had doubted Cruz's sincerity were forced to admit this wasn't scripted. This was raw, unscripted truth, delivered in a way no one could ignore. And yet, for all the headlines, all the memes, all the trending hashtags, the true power of that moment wasn't in the digital noise. It wasn't in the celebrity tweets or the late-night comedy sketches. It was in something deeper, something that would linger long after the memes faded. It was in the lesson cliffhanger. And yet, the true power of this moment wasn't in the headlines. It was in the lesson it left behind. The headlines would fade. The memes would eventually scroll off our feeds. Even the viral hashtags would give way to the next trend. But what would remain, what would echo long after the noise, was not the clash between a Supreme Court justice and a Hollywood star. It was the lesson buried inside it. Tom Cruise didn't step into that chamber to win applause. He didn't rise to his feet to trend on TikTok. He spoke because, in that moment, someone had to. Someone had to remind a nation that truth is bigger than titles, and courage is stronger than power. The clash with Clarence Thomas became symbolic. On one side, arrogance, wrapped in robes, leaning on status, believing itself untouchable. On the other, dignity, carried not by position, but by conviction. This wasn't about Hollywood versus Washington. This was about the eternal struggle between those who wield power without accountability and those who dare to confront it with nothing but words and integrity. And that's why it resonated so deeply. Because every viewer saw themselves in that room. They saw the boss who never listened, the official who abused authority, the bully who believed fear was power, and they saw what happens when someone finally stands up, not with anger, not with violence, but with calm, unshakable truth. Cruz's words reframed the debate into something larger than two men, They became a mirror for society itself. What? Do we honor arrogance or empathy, titles or humanity, fear or courage? The answer was clear in the thunderous applause that followed him. It was clear in the millions of people who shared his words, not because he was famous, but because he was right. And in the end, that was the greatest revelation of all. Fame fades, power shifts, but dignity endures. Cruz's final gift to that audience wasn't just a mic drop line, it was a moral compass. He showed that speaking truth doesn't require robes, gavels, or seats of power. It requires courage. And courage, when spoken with dignity, is contagious. The cameras captured his words. The headlines recorded them. But the real recording was done in the hearts of people who whispered to themselves, "If he can do it, so can I." That is the ripple effect no meme can measure. That is the real legacy. Because in the end, it wasn't about Tom Cruise or Clarence Thomas. It was about justice. It was about the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. It was about proving that no matter how high the walls of arrogance are built, a single voice of truth can still tear them down. And so, when the lights dimmed and the chamber emptied, the lesson remained, echoing louder than any soundbite. In the end, dignity is louder than hate, courage is greater than power, and truth will always outlive arrogance. Cliffhanger into outro. And as the world reflected on that night, one final question remained. What would we do with the lesson left behind? And so we returned to where it all began. Tom Cruise humiliating Clarence Thomas. But as we've seen, it wasn't simply about one man embarrassing another. It wasn't about Hollywood defeating Washington. It was about something larger. A cultural shift, a reminder that arrogance can crumble in an instant when confronted by courage and truth. That night became proof that even the highest titles mean nothing if they are not backed by humility, empathy, and accountability. Clarence Thomas believed his power made him untouchable. Tom Cruise showed the world otherwise, not with special effects, not with scripted lines, but with unshakable conviction. The lesson? Arrogance eventually falls. Truth endures. And dignity, when spoken out loud, is louder than hate could ever be. But here's the bigger question. What will we do with this moment? Will we let it pass as just another viral clip? Or will we carry its lesson forward, into our conversations, into our workplaces, into our communities? Because the real power of that night lies not in Tom Cruise's voice, but in ours. So if you believe in standing up to arrogance, if you believe in courage over corruption, in truth over empty power, then don't let this message stop here. Share this story, subscribe to the channel, and be part of a movement that reminds the world, dignity is undefeated. This isn't just commentary, it's a call. A call for every viewer, every listener, every ordinary person to realize that the fight between arrogance and truth isn't happening on screens alone. It's happening in real life, and now it's your turn to carry the torch.